Hi, JMC Village. Thanks for joining us for our next installment of Speaking with the Village. I'm Joshua Kent coming at you. Today, we're going to be talking about how trauma impacts behavior. And today, we have an amazing special guest, Mr. Scott Hanauer, who helps us with so many trainings and is an expert in the field of trauma behavior and has a lot of experience that we thought would be an awesome tool for our parents and our caregivers out there. So everyone welcome Mr. Scott Hanauer.
All right. Thanks, Joshua.
Yes. So give us a little background. Who's Scott? What has he done?
So just real briefly, I retired about 3.5 years ago as the Chief Executive Officer at Community Youth Services. CYS is a very large nonprofit social service agency that actually does therapeutic foster care. In my retirement, before I was the CEO there, I was the clinical director. So most of my work has been on the clinical side. In my retirement, I do a number of things. I consult at a number of agencies in Washington. I teach at the University of Washington. And we've been studying trauma now for a long time. Kind of the history of that is back in the early 2000s. One of the things that we recognized in our foster care program was that the common theme of nearly every kid, probably every kid that was referred to our foster care program was that they had experienced trauma, some level of complex trauma. And there's a difference between simple trauma and complex trauma. So when I talk about trauma, I'm talking about ongoing kind of trauma, not just a one-time event. Like a car accident would be a simple traumatic event, which could really be impactful on somebody's life, but it's really going to only happen once. You're not going to be in a car accident every day or, every year even. So when we talk about complex trauma, we're talking about, exposure to domestic violence, emotional neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, growing up in families where there's substance use disorder. When we, give parenting classes, we talk about, mention that if anybody grew up in a home where there is alcoholism, for example, it's not a very fun place to be. So those are examples of complex trauma. So back in the early 2000s, we tried to learn as much about trauma as we possibly could. And we went to trainings with people who were considered experts at the time. And we essentially learned two things back then. One is what causes trauma, which is pretty important to know. The second thing we learned is how does it impact people, which is also pretty important to know. But that was the end of the training. Nobody ever told us what we can do to mitigate the impact of complex trauma on kids. So we spent the last, 15, 20 years working with research institutions, mostly the University of Washington, but also Portland State University. And at Portland State University is a department called Trauma Informed Oregon that has all sorts of leading edge research on trauma. And then the University of Oklahoma that we've worked with. So in connecting to those research institutions, what we really wanted to learn is, okay, what can we do to mitigate the impact of trauma on kids? And over the years, we've landed on what we call the second set of skills. So there are parenting skills that we have now about 70, 75 of those skills that we believe can mitigate the impact of trauma in kids' lives. And some of those skills are kind of counterintuitive. So we've kind of codified those skills and have been teaching them now for a long time. So now when we talk with particularly foster parents or staff at like JMC facilities, we don't just talk about trauma-informed care. What we talk about is trauma and resiliency informed care, that people do need to know what causes trauma, how it impacts people. But we spend way more time in trainings and in consultations talking about what are those second set of skills that caregivers can use to mitigate trauma.
The way I like to think about it, in trauma, and the way I like it is almost like a firefighter. Only about 10% of a firefighter's job is fighting fires. They have those other skills and the other resources that they provide to the community and to the people.
Right.
Knowledge of what prevents forest fires, safety skills with a CPR, or helping medical care too. So I definitely can appreciate that. It's more about the prevention of things rather than actually what's going on. It's not so much the fire of the behaviors or the trauma itself. It's going to be more, how do we impact their long-term resiliency to it?
Yes. And I think the firefighting metaphor or analogy is a really good one, is that one of the things that we have learned, for caregivers who are dealing with kids who have experienced trauma, sometimes the behavior is pretty big behavior problems. I mean, these are kids that can be very defiant. They can even be physically aggressive, or verbally aggressive. Sometimes they run away. Sometimes they break things. I just heard about a little 9-year-old boy yesterday who burned down a foster parent's house. So, the behavior can be really, really big and really trying for the caregivers. But what we've learned in this second set of skills is how important it is that we intervene early in escalated behavior problems, like firefighters. Working to prevent fires is way better than waiting for the fires to happen and then, rushing in to try to, put the fire out.
Yeah, it's prevention's the best. Prevention's the best. De-escalation to itself. Kind of having that structure built around you to support a child with trauma is gonna ultimately serve you better than the way you react to it.
Yes.
So what are some of those ways that someone's taking a kiddo into their care? They see some behaviors come up. What are some ways that just broad strokes? I know there's 70, like you're saying, 70 different options, and potentials. But what are some easy ways that a parent that doesn't really know a lot about behavior can help a kiddo experience trauma?
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of key ones, Joshua, I think that are pretty important that we, try to help foster parents or caregivers understand. One is kind of the etiology around power struggle behavior. And how we've come to understand it is being in control of one's life is part of the human condition. We all want to be in control of our lives. And when kids who are in foster care, and maybe those kids who have bounced from placement to placement, feel like their life is out of control, then they're going to look for control anywhere they can find it. And sometimes in power struggles, that could be, there's little power struggles like oppositional behavior. If you're my caregiver and I'm in your home and you say, oh, it looks like the sun's going to come out, it's going to be nice. And I would say, no, it's not. It's going to cloud up and rain. Or you could say it's going to cloud up and rain. And I'm going to say, no, it's not. It's going to clear up and be nice. So it's not about the weather. It's about kind of, saying you're not in control, I'm in control. Or power struggles can be really big power struggles, like running away. What we've also come to understand is most big behavior problems, most of the problems that are, really challenging for caregivers, like, breaking things, running away, physically aggressive behavior, almost always starts with a power struggle. Whether we know we're in a power struggle or not, that's where those big behavior problems usually start. So if we can help foster parents and caregivers begin to understand when they're beginning to get into a power struggle, so that they can, again, be the firefighter, they can deter the power struggle from, flaming up.
Oh man, it is a great. Yeah, it just that the analogy comes through in so many different ways. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really true. And it could be some power is doing nothing. And we've seen
Yes.
that with our kiddos. Some kiddos in our care is the only power they have is that I can sit here and not say anything to you if I want. And sometimes trying to encourage that more and more, it's just going to kind of deeper
Yeah.
ingrain you guys into that power struggle.
Yeah. And I think, the hand, for any family, or quite frankly, any organization, including families, to be effective, there has to be, in a family, the parents have to be here and the kids have to be here in terms of who has authoritative control. But if you're a kid who's bounced around in the foster care system, you're constantly trying to do this, and helping foster parents. When we consult with foster parents, is to say, when do you recognize that your child is starting to, move in this direction? And that's where we want them to intervene, because once it gets to here, probably, game on at that point.
Yeah. For them, escalating behavior, and then, well, I'm going to go to what I know, which
Yep.
is, might be bigger behaviors at that. So
Yes.
yeah, and I like that hand dynamic too, because there's a point where you're here and you meet, and you can say, well, how, as a caregiver, am I going to make sure that I'm still an authority in this position, but also kind of feeding their need of, well, I want some power, I want some choice in this,
Yes.
and finding that balance. I find the best thing is just give them choices that you can handle
Yes.
as a caregiver.
Yeah, and that, using the firefighter, analogy, is one of the ways of deterring power struggles that we do talk with foster parents about, is how important to do just what you said, which is to give your kids as many choices a day as you possibly can. Because two things happen when we give kids choices. Number one is it deters them from getting into power struggles with their caregivers, because they already see the caregiver is giving them benevolent control over their life. The second thing that happens in a neurobiological way is that by giving kids choices, you're actually changing the molecular structure of kids' brains. And that's measurable. So that's kind of the science behind, some of these strategies. These, what we talk about with these second set of skills is that there's actually research and evidence behind it. It's not just, these are good ideas, you got to try them sometimes.
Not just guess and check. A lot of parenting feels like that sometimes, and just being a caregiver feels like that. But kind of having a structure to your guessing and checking can really be supportive.
So giving kids choices, about what you said, Joshua, is giving kids choices about things you don't care about. And it could look like you can wear the brown socks or the blue socks. You can wear socks or not wear socks. You can get up at 8 or 8:06. You can have this much milk or this much milk. So the importance in this, also in this strategy or using this skill, is you actually have to give the kid the choice. You can't assume that he knows or she knows that she has the choice. So the foster parent has to go through, or the caregiver has to go through that process of actually giving the kids choices. The second thing that we've landed on to deter power struggle is how important it is that we limit rigid rules to health and safety. If you ride a bike, you got to wear a helmet. Ride in the car, got to wear a seatbelt. Those are rigid rules. The quality of food that kids eat is not a health and safety issue. The quantity of food, specific bedtimes are not, health and safety issues. So if you're my child and I want to minimize or deter you from getting into power struggles with you, I can say to you, Joshua, bedtime's coming up. You get to choose. You can go to bed at 8 or 8:15. You still got to go to bed at a reasonable time. I'm not saying you get to choose whenever you want to go to bed, but I'm giving you two reasonable options that I can live with. What we do know too with kids who've experienced trauma is when they see people as rigid or they see rules as rigid, they see that as something to push against. So we don't want a lot of rigid rules in families. We nor do we want ourselves to be rigid people.
Yeah, because then it's, it could remove some of the fun of things too, because, I even, and making light of a situation. Do you want to wear blue or brown socks? I want one of each.
Yeah.
They're trying to get in a power struggle with that and try to
Yeah.
make you say no, choose.
Yeah.
But if you're like, all right, cool, yeah, go for it. One of each sounds like a fun day for me. That's gonna bring them, and they're like, wow, they really didn't care. They were really just, giving me a choice and giving me power, and and choice in my own life.
Yeah. I think around the rigid rule things is that I think for most people, it's kind of human nature to push against rules that we think are too rigid or that shouldn't apply to us or are unnecessary. The example that I use in trainings a lot is, if you drive down the freeway and the speed limit is 60 and there's not a lot of traffic, people aren't going 60. They're going 65, 68, 70, 75, maybe even faster, because it's kind of human nature to push against rules that we see as rigid and really aren't necessary to apply to us.
Yeah, and then same with that one. Comes down to health, and it comes down to safety. At that point, is how safe do you feel and in control of your car speeding down the highway? If there's a lot of cars around you, it's going to be a little bit of a trickier way to maintain that safety and that feeling of safety, which is ultimately what we just want to keep our kids safe, because these tough behaviors can put them in some unsafe situations.
Right, and then you're using the freeway example. If you go more than about 7 or 8 miles an hour over, now you're opening yourself up to, being pulled over, especially if you're going 10 or 15 or 20 miles an hour over. So, you don't want to be turning the life or the decisions about your life over to somebody else, like a police officer. But that inclination to push against the rules is still there.
Get as close as you can. Everyone's got their internal rule, and that's kind of how it is with creating boundaries within, the care of your child and how much freedom to give them. Is like, you kind of have that own personal rule. Like for me, it's like, okay, if I'm going 5 over, I feel good. I feel like safe enough not to get pulled over, but I'm still like keeping up with traffic. So it's that nice in between of having your internal rules that is going to be your hard line. And it's really going to impact you. And then where you can, give a little flexibility, give a little love and support to them.
I have a friend who's a retired county sheriff, and he said his rule of thumb was 8, you're fine, 9, you're mine. Meaning he'll tolerate people going 8 miles an hour over the speed limit. But once you get above 9, now you're vulnerable.
Yeah, that's when it's no longer up to you. And that's when it's going to be a tougher feeling to overcome, and you're going to learn from those behaviors, and sometimes it's a tough lesson, and we want to give the learning opportunities without the tough lessons, so kind of shaping that the environment to breed success within those choices is really crucial, I think, and what I've found personally just through experience. And it sounds like the research backs it up.
Yes, the research does back it up. So that's just one, dealing with power struggles is just one example of those second set of skills, and there's obviously a lot more. Another one that I think we found that foster parents, that resonates pretty well with foster parents, is them recognizing the difference between targets or triggers of escalated behavior and antecedents of escalated behavior. Whoops, where's my hand? So triggers of escalated behavior are things like if a child hears the word no, or if they, don't get a certain food that they want to eat, or that they have to go to bed, that those are triggers, which are important to know, for a caregiver to know what are the triggers of, for their kids. But what's more important, we found, is foster parents and caregivers understanding what are the antecedents of their kids' escalated behavior. And the antecedents are, what are the nonverbal cues that kids are giving that they're becoming dysregulated. And interestingly, whenever I ask parents, foster parents, adoptive parents, kinship parents to tell me what the antecedents are for their kids' behavior, they can always tell you. They always know. But the key to this is that's where, as soon as they recognize the antecedents of their child's escalated behavior, that's where we want them to intervene. We don't want them to wait. So I was consulting with some adoptive parents who have a 9-year-old little boy who he has pretty big naughty behavior problems. I mean, he tries to hurt people, he breaks things, he bolts, he runs, those kinds of things. So when I asked his parents one time, what are the antecedents of his escalated behavior? His mom looks up and she goes, it's a look in his eye. She goes, I can tell by the look in his eye that he's having a bad day or he's having a bad moment. And so we want them, his parents, to intervene when they see that nonverbal antecedent. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, and sometimes even broadcasting it to let them, depending, you gotta know your child, and that's what's gonna make the best care. And like you said, recognizing the antecedents and being like, hey, I notice this is happening, and in the past, remember when we, had this look in our eye and we were near the playground and we went and ran on it, or we got hurt, kind of thing, and just kind of painting them a picture because they know, some kiddos know that they're starting to get that way, and if you can see it, they're feeling it. That's definitely, if their emotions are boiling enough to point to show it externally, that's when you as a parent need to say, like, okay, well, now I know that this is coming about. And so and I think that's really crucial, is that a trigger can be very, dependent on, the environment, but but knowing the antecedent can be very child specific too, and what they're going to be doing before their behavior.
Right. And we ask that caregivers to do some specific things when they notice the antecedent. One is also to know whether their child is the kind of child that de-escalates better if the parent brings them closer to them, or is their child do better de-escalating if they're away. And it's important to know which category your kid fits into, because if I'm a kid that doesn't like to be touched, I don't like to be, it stresses me out to be close to somebody. And when I'm stressed out, my caregiver wants me to go sit with them and talk to them and make eye contact with them. That may escalate me even more. And I may be the kind of kid that is better off saying, oh, you just, that you have that look in your eye, or you just rolled your eyes, or you just shrugged a certain way. Maybe you should go, into the family room and spend a little time by yourself. I may be the kind of kid that de-escalates way better by myself than being closer. And there's kids that do better when they're closer. Like that little boy, the 9-year-old little boy that I was just referring to, he did better when his parents brought him closer to them. They would go get a blanket and sit on the couch, and then, he wasn't in any trouble. He just, they just sat with him until he kind of got himself back into self-regulation.
Yeah, don't want to add more stress to a situation that is already starting to, bring about stress within that child.
Right,
so
right.
Physical space is a huge part of it, because it's that first thing that we take in sensory wise. We see it. We see what's going on. We can feel the people near us, and it can either add or reduce stress, and we're all different. So knowing our kiddos is ultimately gonna inform our reaction to their behaviors the best, is what it sounds like. Awesome. Wow, that was a lot of great insight, and kind of a great briefing to like the if that's only two things, that there's so much more that we can think about and care. And it really sounds like it's not necessarily an antidote, but a tool belt for these caregivers. They don't need to, they don't need to buy the instant food in one pack. They need to buy a pantry worth of food to help deal with some of these kiddos and their behaviors. Is how I like to see it.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we found, Joshua, is that when parents are, when they understand kind of the science behind it, that there actually is science, then it resonates with them. So we do talk to foster parents as a foundational kind of training about the neurobiology of trauma. And, we're telling them a little bit about what parts of the brain are activated so that that are activated during, traumatic events. And so helping parents know that what they're doing is not just managing behavior, but that they actually are changing the molecular structure of kids' brains. Tomorrow morning, I have the opportunity to meet with my panel of neurology folks at the University of Washington. And one of the things that they just let me know last week was that they have actually identified the resiliency gene in the human genome. And so the discussion tomorrow is, if you don't have that gene, or if that gene in your DNA isn't well developed, can you still be resilient? And can we build that resiliency, in kids?
Well, that's what the fun thing about science is, that it brings about, the new potential for things. Things have been unavailable before, and that knowledge is power, and science behind it will give us that power to hopefully impact these kiddos in a good way.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. This has been a great, I think, kind of, broad overview of how, trauma impacts behavior. It's when we were getting ready for this, it's true. There's 20 different avenues we can go, and speak hours about it, and whether it's science or just, experience, and the reaction to it. So, is there anything that you would like to say to any potential foster parents or foster parents out there to, give them a little insight, give them a little encouragement when they're dealing with a kiddo that has some tough behaviors impacted by trauma?
Well, I just think some of, some things that I think just need to be in place. One is we know historically that when kids move from placement to placement to placement, it's usually because of a behavior problem. And that the work that we've been doing really is in some ways predicated on the idea of placement stability. That if we can keep kids stable in placement, then we can use these second set of skills. But if kids are bouncing from place to place, it's really hard to get traction to, any kind of new ideas. You can't do these things just once or twice. You have to do them over and over again. In fact, when I do trainings at the University of Washington and other places, I have at the beginning of the trainings, I have what I call a weasel clause. And the weasel clause is nobody can go back and tell me that what we talked about didn't work unless you've documented that you've tried it 5,000 times. Because behavior does not change by one intervention. I wish it did, but in fact,
so much easier. Why not? Come on.
Yeah,
you got to really do some brain science to figure that one out, I guess.
Right. So, and when I say that about 5,000, people have to document that they've done it 5,000 times. I get a lot of like, oh, that's really funny. And I say, I'm not really joking. That it's behavior changes by us doing the same things over and over and over again. But you also have to know what things to do over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you have to know that. Yeah, and I like that you said it, because those behaviors didn't come about just overnight either. That was from continued exposure to, to traumatic events, and that's why trauma really does with these kiddos come from a continuous source, or a repeating source rather than just a one-time incident. So, behaviors can't change positively overnight, and because they didn't come about in the challenging way overnight either. So, it takes time and resilience for all of us, caregivers and children alike. So,
that's for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for joining us, giving us a little insight on how trauma impacts behavior. We'll chat hopefully sometime soon, and just we'll see you around the foster care community.
All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott.